Even after years of facing the darkness, certain cases stay with me. Eric's story is one of them. It was a rainy night. Outside, the cold wind and fine drizzle battered against the windows, creating a rhythmic yet unsettling noise. Inside our base, the silence was almost sacred. Gabriel sat at the desk, meticulously cleaning his old hunting knife, his focus so intense it resembled a sacred ritual. I was skimming through a newspaper, half-heartedly reading articles about paranormal incidents, but none managed to grab my attention. Suddenly, the phone rang, shattering the quiet. Gabriel picked it up, his voice calm and steady as always. Gabriel speaking. On the other end was a middle-aged man, his voice urgent and tense. "Mr. Gabriel, my name is Edward Clark. I need your help." I set the newspaper down, watching Gabriel as he listened. A faint crease formed on his brow, a sign he was trying to gauge the caller's intent. "Go on," Gabriel said, his tone giving nothing away. Edward's words came quickly, tumbling out like he had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times. He described his son Eric, who had been steadily wasting away, losing weight, energy, and even his will to live. The doctors insisted nothing was wrong, but Edward wasn't convinced. His voice carried the weight of frustration and desperation. "The doctors say he's fine, but he's not. Every day he gets worse. I know something's not right." "What makes you think this is paranormal?" Gabriel asked. There was a pause on the other end, followed by a quieter, almost embarrassed reply. "It started after he got involved with a Japanese girl named Yuki. Things got strange while they were together, but after they broke up, it got much worse. He barely eats or sleeps now, and he keeps muttering her name, Yuki, over and over. I've run out of options. That's why I'm calling you." Gabriel didn't respond immediately. He seemed to consider the situation, then said, "Send me your address. We'll come." Rich clients usually mean big problems, I joked as I pulled on my jacket. "At least the pay is good." Gabriel didn't reply. He was already preparing his equipment, his movements swift and methodical. That was his way, less talk, more action. Edward's mansion was a sprawling estate on the outskirts of town. As we approached, the ornate iron gates creaked open to reveal an imposing structure shrouded in an eerie stillness. The air felt heavy, and not a single bird chirped in the trees surrounding the property. Edward greeted us at the entrance. He was a tall, well-dressed man whose polished exterior couldn't hide the exhaustion etched into his face. He gripped Gabriel's hand tightly, like a drowning man holding onto a lifeline. "Thank you for coming," he said. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the desperation of someone at the end of his rope. His tone sent a chill down my spine. I didn't say it out loud, but I had a bad feeling about this. Edward led us upstairs. The air grew colder with each step, and the dimly lit hallway felt unnaturally quiet. Paintings lined the walls, their subjects' eyes seeming to follow us as we passed. When we entered Eric's room, I nearly mistook him for a corpse. He was skeletal, his skin so pale it was almost translucent. His sunken eyes stared blankly at nothing, and his cracked lips murmured the same name repeatedly. "Yuki, Yuki, is he even alive?" I whispered to Gabriel. Gabriel stepped closer, waving a hand in front of Eric's face. There was no response, not even a flicker of acknowledgement. Gabriel turned to Edward and said, "From what I can see, part of his soul is missing." "His soul?" Edward's voice wavered between disbelief and fear. "You're saying this is supernatural? Just because something can't be explained by science doesn't mean it doesn't exist." Gabriel's tone was calm but firm. "Something has taken a part of his soul. That's why he's in this state." Edward's brow furrowed as he struggled to process Gabriel's words. "This sounds like something out of a fairy tale, but I know my son isn't fine, no matter what the doctors say. He's dying. If this is supernatural, can you save him?" "That depends on the root cause," Gabriel replied. "We'll need to know more about his connection to Yuki, and anything she might have left behind." Edward hesitated for a moment, then pulled a pocket watch from his jacket and handed it to Gabriel. "She gave him this for his birthday. He's carried it with him ever since." Gabriel examined the watch carefully, turning it over in his hands. After a moment, he said, "We'll use this to find her." A lifetime of hunting the paranormal has taught me one thing. The most dangerous threats often hide behind harmless appearances. That night, back at our base, Gabriel began analyzing the pocket watch Edward had given us. I sat nearby watching him work. The watch looked ordinary at first glance, but I knew better than to dismiss something Gabriel took seriously. "Anything special about it?" I asked, breaking the silence. Gabriel didn't respond right away. Instead, he placed the watch on a sheet of parchment inscribed with strange symbols. His fingers glided across the surface of the watch, and he closed his eyes as if concentrating on something intangible. After a long pause, he opened his eyes and said, "It's stained with remnants of a soul." "Remnants of a soul?" I frowned. "Are you saying Yuki used it as, what, a conduit?" "Exactly. The essence tied to this object is likely why Eric couldn't sever his connection to her," Gabriel explained, his tone measured. "So, can we use it to find her?" I asked, leaning forward. "We can try." Gabriel pulled out a small mirror and a handful of candles from his toolbox, arranging them with precision on the table. He lit the candles and began murmuring an incantation, his voice low and deliberate. The air around us seemed to shift, growing heavier with each syllable. As the candle flames flickered, the surface of the mirror began to shimmer. Slowly, an image appeared. A modest room, sparsely furnished. A faint light streamed in through a small window, and in the center of the room, a woman sat at a vanity, brushing her long, dark hair. Though her face was obscured, her slender figure and movements made it unmistakably her. "Is that her apartment?" I asked. Gabriel nodded. "Judging by the architecture and lighting, it's in Tokyo." The next morning, Gabriel shared our findings with Edward. Surprisingly, the mention of Tokyo didn't seem to shock him. "I already had people look into her," Edward admitted. "She lives in an apartment near Tokyo's Haneda Airport. My investigators say she hasn't worked any flights recently, though. No one knows what she's been doing. She's likely avoiding public life," Gabriel mused. "If she's aware of what she is, she's probably trying to stay hidden." Edward's face darkened. "If she really is what you say, a monster, does my son have any hope?" "There's a chance," Gabriel said flatly. "But resolving this won't be easy." Edward nodded, his expression hardening. "I'll arrange a private flight to Tokyo, whatever it takes to save my son." On the plane, I leaned back in my seat, pretending to sleep, but my mind was racing. The image of Yuki from the mirror lingered in my thoughts, her presence both haunting and unnervingly human. "What's on your mind?" Gabriel asked, breaking the silence. "If Yuki is a soul eater," I began, choosing my words carefully, "then were her feelings for Eric real?" Gabriel's eyes remained fixed on the notebook in his lap. "Some entities mimic human emotions, but their nature doesn't change. Whether she loved him or not doesn't matter. What matters is what she's done to him." His words left me with more questions than answers. Was love enough to redeem a monster? Or was it just another mask they wore? The plane landed in the hazy glow of Tokyo's evening lights. Edward had arranged for a car to take us to Yuki's apartment. As we approached the building, I noticed something strange. The streets around the apartment complex were eerily silent, and a cluster of stray cats lingered near the entrance. Their eyes glinted in the dim light, unblinking as they watched us. "There's something off about this place," I muttered. Gabriel surveyed the area and said, "Supernatural events often attract animals sensitive to energy. These cats might be picking up on something." As we stood across the street, the apartment building loomed before us. It was old and worn, with cracks running along the exterior walls. The dim lights in the hallways flickered sporadically, casting long, distorted shadows. "The atmosphere here is too quiet," I whispered, a shiver running down my spine. "Silence isn't always a bad thing," Gabriel replied, his tone steady. "The real danger lies in what's hiding behind it." We took up a position in the shadows of a nearby alley, watching the building. Hours passed, and the night deepened. The stray cats remained scattered around the complex, occasionally letting out low, guttural sounds that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Close to midnight, the hallway lights in the building flickered and dimmed, leaving only a faint, intermittent glow. A cold breeze swept through the alley, carrying with it a faint metallic smell, like rust or blood. "Do you feel that?" I asked Gabriel, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," he replied, his eyes narrowing. "Stay sharp." Just as he spoke, a slender figure emerged from the shadows at the end of the street. She was dressed in a dark coat, her long hair swaying slightly in the breeze. Though her face was obscured by the shadows, there was no doubt. It was Yuki. "She's here," Gabriel murmured, his voice tight with focus. "Let's move." We trailed her from a distance as she approached the building and entered through the front door. Gabriel signaled for me to follow closely as we slipped inside behind her. The air in the hallway was cold, unnaturally so, and the faint hum of the fluorescent lights buzzed ominously overhead. As we climbed the stairs, the faint creak of the wooden floorboards underfoot echoed in the narrow space. The walls were lined with faded, crooked paintings, their subjects' faces blurred and indistinct, as though distorted by time or something more sinister. "These paintings," I whispered. "Why are they all crooked?" Gabriel's voice was low but firm. "It's not the paintings. It's the building itself. Whatever energy lingers here is warping the structure." When we reached Yuki's apartment door, Gabriel didn't hesitate. He knocked firmly. The sound echoed through the hallway, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, a hesitant voice called out from the other side. "Who is it?" Gabriel's response was calm but commanding. "Eric's friend." There was a pause, followed by hurried footsteps. The door remained closed. Gabriel reached into his pocket, pulling out a small bag of salt. He sprinkled it along the doorframe, muttering a quiet incantation. The salt glimmered faintly as it settled. "Open the door, Yuki," Gabriel said, his tone leaving no room for argument. A few tense seconds passed before the door creaked open. Yuki stood there, her pale face framed by the dim light inside. Her eyes darted between us, filled with fear and suspicion. "I don't know anyone named Eric," she said, her voice trembling. Gabriel stepped forward and, without warning, flung a handful of salt at her. The moment it made contact, she screamed, a high-pitched, inhuman sound. Her body convulsed, and her face contorted, revealing markings beneath her skin that no human should have. "Trap her!" Gabriel shouted. I sprang into action, pulling out a prepared cloth marked with sigils. I quickly laid it on the ground and drew a containment circle around her. Yuki thrashed and clawed at the edges of the circle, but the moment she touched the markings, she recoiled as though struck by an invisible force. Within moments, she collapsed to the ground, breathing heavily. Tokyo's lights shine brightly at night, but the darkness hiding beyond them runs far deeper. Yuki's apartment building stood out like a relic of the past, a crumbling structure in the middle of a bustling modern city. The windows were smudged with grime, and cracks ran along the walls like veins. In the neon glow of Tokyo's streets, the building seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. We waited in the shadows of a nearby alley. Midnight approached, and the air was thick with tension. The flickering hallway lights inside the building occasionally cast long shadows across the street. Stray cats prowled the area, their movements slow and deliberate. Their eyes glinted unnaturally in the dim light, as if they were watching something we couldn't see. "What's with all these cats?" I whispered to Gabriel. "They're drawn to energy disturbances," Gabriel replied quietly, his gaze fixed on the building. "Sensitive animals like cats can sense things humans can't." The air felt heavy, and a faint metallic scent lingered. It reminded me of rust or old blood. My palms were slick with sweat as I gripped the edge of my jacket, bracing myself for whatever might come next. Suddenly, the hallway lights inside the building flickered violently, then went out altogether. A cold breeze swept through the alley, carrying with it a whisper of something I couldn't quite hear. "Stay sharp," Gabriel muttered. Just as Gabriel spoke, a figure emerged at the far end of the street. She moved slowly, her long coat trailing behind her as the wind caught her hair. Even from a distance, her silhouette was unmistakable. "It's her," Gabriel said, his voice a low growl. Yuki walked toward the apartment building, her head down, her movements purposeful. She didn't look around or acknowledge her surroundings, as though the world outside the building didn't exist for her. Gabriel motioned for me to follow as we crept across the street. Yuki pushed open the front door and disappeared inside. Gabriel's hand brushed the hilt of a small dagger strapped to his belt, a subtle sign that he was ready for trouble. "Let's go," he whispered. Inside, the air was cold, far colder than it had any right to be. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzed unevenly overhead. Every step we took on the wooden floorboards echoed, the sound magnified by the building's eerie silence. As we climbed the narrow staircase, I noticed a series of crooked paintings lining the walls. Each frame held a portrait, but the faces inside were blurred, their features indistinct. It was as if time or something darker had warped them. "These paintings," I said under my breath, "why do they look like that?" "It's not the paintings," Gabriel replied. "The building itself is being warped by residual energy. It's deteriorating under the strain." A shiver ran down my spine. The deeper we went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a warning, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We reached Yuki's apartment and stopped outside the door. Gabriel knocked firmly, the sound echoing through the hallway. A hesitant voice answered from inside. "Who is it?" "Eric's friend," Gabriel said, his voice calm but commanding. There was a long pause, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps. The door didn't open. Gabriel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pouch of salt. He sprinkled it along the door frame, muttering a low incantation. The salt began to glimmer faintly, the lines glowing as if charged with energy. "Open the door, Yuki," Gabriel said. His tone left no room for argument. Moments later, the door creaked open. Yuki stood in the dim light of the doorway, her pale face framed by long, dark hair. Her eyes darted between us, wide with fear. "I don't know anyone named Eric," she said quickly, her voice trembling. Gabriel didn't respond. Instead, he reached into his pocket and flung a handful of salt at her. The reaction was immediate. Yuki screamed, a high-pitched, unnatural sound that sent a chill through the hallway. Her body convulsed, and her face contorted, markings emerging across her skin like cracks in porcelain. "Trap her," Gabriel barked. I fumbled with the sigil cloth and chalk, hastily drawing a containment circle on the floor. Yuki staggered back, but as soon as she touched the edge of the circle, an invisible force slammed her to the ground. She thrashed wildly, her nails clawing at the floor, but the sigils held firm. When the struggle finally subsided, Yuki slumped inside the circle, her breathing ragged. Her features began to shift back to normal, but her body remained unnaturally still. Yuki slowly raised her head, her eyes filled with fear and exhaustion. Her voice was hoarse as she spoke. Why are you here?" "Eric," Gabriel said flatly. "What did you do to him?" Yuki's lips trembled, and for a moment, it seemed like she might refuse to answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I'm a soul eater. I didn't mean to hurt him." "A soul eater?" I echoed, incredulous. "So you've been draining his soul?" Yuki shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "At first, he was just a target. His soul was so pure, so bright. I couldn't resist it. But then I fell in love with him. I stopped taking from him. I tried to leave to keep him safe. But his soul is still incomplete," Gabriel interrupted, his tone as sharp as a blade. "If you really stopped, why is he still dying?" Yuki's voice broke. "I gave back what I could, but I can't return all of it. It's become a part of me. If I give it back, She hesitated, her voice trembling. "I'll be too weak to survive." Gabriel's expression didn't soften. "You've left him no choice. Either you return what you took or he dies." Yuki's shoulders slumped, and her gaze dropped to the floor. "If I do, I might not survive the process. That's not our problem, Gabriel said coldly. Decide now. Either you fix this or we'll do it for you. And so, the first part of this mission came to a close, but the true battle was only just beginning. Yuki's confession left us with more questions than answers, and her fate, and Eric's, now hung by a fragile thread. Would she risk her very existence to save the man she loved? Could Gabriel's relentless judgment see through the tangled web of guilt and redemption? And how far was I willing to go to make sense of it all? The answers lay ahead, waiting in the shadows. Stay tuned for the second part of episode 10, where the final confrontation will reveal the ultimate cost of love, sacrifice, and the fight against darkness.